The Massacre at the Forest House. It all began with a call. A frantic plea from frightened residents claiming to have heard screams and seen disturbing lights in the old house by the woods. They whispered about the place, saying it had been empty for decades. My partner, Lucio, and I were dispatched to investigate, with simple instructions to check it out. But we knew it could be much more than a simple patrol. The drive to the house felt endless, the darkness thick, and the twisted branches of the trees cast unsettling shadows. When we finally saw the house, it was everything you'd expect of an abandoned place. Cracked walls, shattered windows, but, unexpectedly, there were lights in the windows, casting strange shadows. It was as if something or someone was waiting for us. We entered cautiously, weapons drawn, our flashlights illuminating a dust-covered floor marked with footprints. A strong smell of mold mixed with something sour hit us, reminding me of old blood. Each step on the creaking floor added to the oppressive silence that seemed to hold its breath. Moving down a dark hallway, the tension grew. We reached the main room and saw something disturbing, handprints covering the walls. They were small, red-stained, resembling dried blood, as if someone had tried desperately to leave a mark, a trace of their existence. Before we could fully process it, we heard heavy footsteps upstairs. "Lucio," I called, but he was already in position, weapon aimed, watching the floor above. We rushed up the stairs, each step creaking as if it might give way at any moment. At the top, the bedroom doors were ajar, shadows inside. We heard something, a disturbing laughter, like many voices blending into one. Then, the attack came. Something invisible hit Lucio with force. He fell, his weapon slipping from his hand. Without thinking, I fired towards the sound, but it was like shooting at nothing. The bullets passed through the air without hitting anything. Panic crept over me as I realized we were being hunted, and whatever was in that house wanted us there. One of the bedroom doors slowly opened with a painful creak. In the darkness, a figure appeared. It was a woman or something that seemed like one, pale-skinned, with dark, hollow eyes and an expression frozen in rage, as if her pain and anger had solidified on her face forever. She took a step toward us, and from her mouth came a scream. But it wasn't just one voice. It was a sound of countless voices, all screaming in desperation and agony. Lucio, dazed on the floor, managed to grab his gun again and fired at the figure, but it did nothing. She kept advancing, each step slow and menacing, as if feeding off our fear. Her laughter grew louder, shrill, mocking our attempts to stop her. Heart racing, I grabbed Lucio by the arm, and we bolted for the stairs, but something was pulling us back. I felt invisible hands grabbing at my clothes, scratching my skin, trying to keep us inside. It was a struggle against an unseen force that seemed to be everywhere, pulling us backward with each step we took toward the exit. Finally, we made it to the front door, and everything stopped. Silence returned. A silence so complete it felt like the nightmare had been just a fevered hallucination. The house, now pitch dark, was enveloped in quiet. There were no more lights, no sounds, no screams, just the wind whispering through the trees. We stumbled back to the patrol car, battered and breathless. I looked over at Lucio. He was in shock, a vacant stare in his eyes, as if his mind was still trapped inside the house. We tried to report what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. How could we explain the inexplicable? Who would believe us? A few weeks later, we learned the story of the house. Decades earlier, it had been the scene of a massacre. The details were scarce, but they said an entire family had been murdered there, and the spirit of the woman, the mother, had never left. Since then, the house had stood, a haunted reminder of that horrific event. No one wanted to go near it, and those who dared never left, without something dark lingering in their souls. Since that night, no police officer has been sent to patrol the area, and the townspeople still hear the same screams and laughter on windy nights. As if the massacre is trapped in a loop, replaying over and over, leaving a permanent mark of pain and vengeance in that house of horrors. The night on Cliff Road. It was a cold, eerie early morning, and the road skirting the cliff seemed emptier than ever. Ribeiro and I were on patrol, covering that isolated stretch avoided by most locals. It was no secret that dark stories lingered around this place. People said strange accidents happened there, that people vanished without a trace, as if the road itself were a predator, lurking in wait. Then, our radio crackled to life. A faint, trembling voice warned us about a car stalled in the middle of the road, no sign of movement around it. It was odd for anyone to be there at that hour, especially at a place known for its haunting reputation. But duty called, and we had to investigate. When we arrived, we saw the car with its headlights cutting through the fog, casting distorted shadows into the dark. The first thing we noticed was the silence. No sound except for the wind, which blew with such force it almost seemed to carry whispers. We decided to inspect the vehicle, and when I opened the driver's door, the seat was empty. But the engine was still warm. A metallic scent filled the air, like fresh blood mixed with decay. A chill ran down our spines, but the car offered no clues about what had happened. Just as we turned to head back to the patrol car, we heard it, dragging footsteps, slowly approaching. We drew our weapons, spinning around, but all we saw were shifting shadows in the fog, moving as if they were alive. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling that we weren't alone grew stronger. The road, cloaked in mist, seemed darker, as if the night itself had become a living presence, pressing in on us. Then, near the cliff's edge, a figure appeared. A man, standing still, his face pale as wax, his eyes blank and hollow, stared straight at us, without a hint of emotion. Without a word, he took a step toward the edge and, without hesitating, vanished into the darkness below. Ribeiro and I exchanged a glance. At that moment, we both knew we needed to leave, because, whatever we were facing, we couldn't fight it. We quickly got into the patrol car, but as soon as we did, the radio hissed to life. At first it was just static, but then a low, agonized voice came through. "Help me, please help." It was the same voice from the call that had led us to the road. The sound was faint, as though coming from far away, but each word carried a desperation that sent a shiver down our spines. "Let's get out of here," Ribeiro said, struggling to keep calm. He turned the key, but the engine wouldn't start. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The man was standing in the middle of the road behind us, watching the car with a twisted, inhuman smile. Ribeiro finally got the engine running, but just as we tried to speed away, the car lost power and died completely. The figure began to approach, each step cutting through the silence, his slow movements amplifying our feeling of entrapment. A violent bang shattered the driver's window, shards of glass scattering everywhere. Ribeiro fired his weapon, but it was useless. The man continued forward, relentless, as if nothing could stop him. Desperate, we abandoned the patrol car and ran to the stalled car, our last hope of escape. We activated the emergency radio, but the static was deafening. I fumbled with the dial, trying to call for help, anything. And then I felt it, an invisible force gripping me, pulling me toward the cliff. It was as if unseen hands were dragging us, ready to cast us into the darkness below. I clawed at the asphalt, fighting with everything I had, and saw Ribeiro doing the same, struggling against something we couldn't see, but could feel all around us, like an invisible net closing in. By some miracle, we managed to break free. When we finally reached the car and sped away from that stretch of road, we were shaken, our breaths ragged. But the worst came afterward. A few days later, we looked into the history of that road and learned that years before, a man had disappeared there. He was last seen standing by the cliff on a foggy night, and since then, his story had become one of the legends haunting the place. Since that night, we've avoided the cliff road. No patrols go there after dark. Those brave enough to cross the stretch claim to hear voices and see shadows watching from within the mist. And all of them avoid mentioning the man, his twisted smile, and his haunting plea that lingers on the wind and in the darkness. The whisper in the station. The early hours of dawn always brought a profound silence that filled every corner of the station. It was the kind of shift that felt almost solitary, with hours that stretched slowly, filled only by paperwork and stacked reports. Between midnight and 5 a.m., the building seemed to hibernate, a place empty and deserted. But that night felt different. There was a weight in the air, an almost indescribable feeling that something lurked in the shadows, waiting to be found. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself alone in the records room, surrounded by dusty folders and seemingly endless metal shelves. The quiet was complete, broken only by the slow ticking of a clock, marking each second like a distant heartbeat. I was searching for a report filed over 20 years ago when a strange sound echoed through the room. At first, I thought it was just a piece of paper falling or maybe a rodent among the shelves. But the sound persisted, evolving into something more, a whisper. I tried to brush it off as my mind playing tricks, but the whisper continued, soft, nearly inaudible, but insistent. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my work, but the sound grew louder as if someone hidden among the shelves was speaking. I could swear it came from the far end of the room, among the files of old unsolved cases. With hesitation, I got up and began to walk slowly through the rows of shelves, trying to locate the source. Each step I took seemed to make the whisper shift, sometimes drawing away, sometimes getting closer, as if it were playing with me. My breathing grew shallow, and the air grew colder as I neared a darkened corner of the room. That's where the sound concentrated, growing louder until I could finally understand. Help me. I stood still for a moment, nearly paralyzed by fear, but curiosity and a sense of duty urged me forward. My hand trembled as I reached for the files in that section, flipping through the aging documents. Then I found an unusual folder. On it was written, Clara Santos disappearance, 1998. When I opened the file, a photograph of a young woman with a warm smile looked back at me. This was Clara Santos, who had vanished without a trace more than 2 decades ago. The report detailed how she had disappeared without a single clue left behind. No body, no evidence. The case had been filed away as unsolved. As I read the details, the whispers suddenly stopped, leaving a profound, almost suffocating silence, as if the presence had simply dissipated. But the silence brought no relief. On the contrary, the air felt heavier, as if something were right behind me. I turned slowly, expecting to see someone or something, but there was only darkness. The following days were a strange mix of unease and obsession. The whisper haunted me whenever I was alone, particularly in the early hours. The same plea, the same voice, help me. That voice seemed etched into my mind, and I couldn't shake the image of Clara. I began revisiting the case, digging into overlooked details, asking older colleagues if they recalled anything that might shed light on the mystery. But everyone confirmed the same thing. It was a dead end, a cold case that should never have been reopened. One night, as I reviewed the documents again, the whisper returned. This time it was more desperate, nearly a plea. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, something pulling me toward a corner shelf. That spot seemed darker, colder than the rest of the room, as if Clara were guiding me, pleading for me to uncover what had been forgotten. With a mixture of fear and determination, I opened one of the metal drawers. Beneath stacks of forgotten folders, I found a small, unlabeled box. Inside was a silver bracelet, engraved with the name Clara. The discovery shocked me. I had no idea how the item had ended up there or why no one had found it before. I felt an immediate sense of having uncovered something significant, and I sent the bracelet to forensics for analysis. But the results were frustratingly inconclusive. No one could explain how the bracelet had been placed there or who it officially belonged to. It was as if it had always been there, waiting for someone to find it. The case remained unresolved, but my sense of connection to Clara deepened, as though the mystery had become part of me. Since finding the bracelet, the whisper has not returned. The nights at the station resumed their usual stillness, but I was never quite the same. Whenever I was alone, especially in the records room, I felt Clara's presence nearby. It was as though she were still there, not seeking revenge or resolution, but simply waiting to be acknowledged. To this day, the mystery of Clara Santos remains unsolved, and the weight of her whisper lingers within me. Whenever someone mentions old cases, I can't help but think back to that night, because sometimes there are stories that never truly end. They simply become part of the darkness that dwells in forgotten places. The call that never came. It was a silent, cold night, and I was alone on the emergency call shift. The hours passed slowly, filled only with the occasional call, minor accidents, a few arguments. Nothing unusual. I'd grown accustomed to the monotony of the night shifts, but that night something felt different, something that would forever change the way I saw my job. Around 2 in the morning, the phone rang. The line was filled with static, the voice on the other end faint, breathless. "Please, I need help, he's after me," a woman's desperate, urgent voice said. I tried to calm her, assuring her that help would be on the way. "Where are you?" I asked, but the answer was difficult to make out. The static increased, cutting off her words. I could only make out Avenida Santos Dumont before the call abruptly ended. I tried calling back, but the number didn't exist. It was as if the call had come from nowhere. The unsettling nature of this left me uneasy, but I tried to rationalize it, maybe a glitch in the system. I immediately called the closest patrol and relayed the information. A squad car was dispatched to the avenue she had mentioned, a deserted part of the city surrounded by vacant lots and a few old buildings. When the officers arrived, they found the avenue empty. There was no sign of movement, no trace that anyone had been there. The place was silent, save for the wind blowing through the streetlights. They searched the area and checked a few side streets but found nothing. When the officers confirmed they'd found nothing, I tried to shake off the strange call, telling myself it could have been a prank or a panicked person. But something kept gnawing at me. The woman's voice, the desperation and fear I'd heard, it was hard to ignore. The following nights, I returned to work with a lingering feeling that something was about to happen. It was an unshakable feeling. 4 days later, at the exact same time, the phone rang again. And it was her voice. "Please help me, he's found me again," the woman said, her voice more frightened than before. I could hear her breathing heavily, as if she were running. Again, the line was filled with static, making it hard to hear clearly. I tried desperately to get more information. "Who's chasing you? Where are you now?" I asked, but just as before, the line dropped, ending the call. This time, I didn't hesitate. I knew something was wrong. I immediately contacted the patrol and dispatched another car to the same avenue, hoping to find some sign. But once again, when the officers arrived, everything was calm. No cars, no pedestrians, no lights on in the houses nearby. The avenue looked frozen in time, cut off from the rest of the city. My unease continued to grow. I tried to trace the call, but found nothing. It was as if the number didn't exist. I started digging through central records, hoping to find anything that could help me understand what was happening. Then, I found a piece of information in the archives, a missing person report dated exactly 15 years earlier. On that same avenue, a woman had made a frantic call to the police, claiming she was being chased by a man. She was never seen again. The report described the search efforts at the time, which had yielded nothing. The case had been closed with no leads, and the woman, a young woman named Daniela, had vanished without a trace. The call I received that night couldn't have been a mere coincidence. What if the woman calling was Daniela? What if she was somehow trapped between the past and the present, trying to reach out, but unable to escape? The calls continued, always at the same hour, every 3 or 4 nights. Each time, the woman's voice grew more frantic, and I tried everything I could to trace the origin of the calls, but it was no use. Every attempt at tracing failed. All that remained was the increasing sense that I was dealing with something far beyond the natural. On the 5th call, something even more disturbing happened. I strained to listen through the static for any detail, when I heard another sound in the background. It was heavy breathing, raspy, and it didn't belong to the woman. "He's here," she whispered, her voice shaking, and then the call ended again. This time I didn't send a patrol. I went myself to the avenue. I sped through the empty streets until I reached the location, Avenida Santos Dumont. When I parked, everything was the same as the other nights, deserted and quiet. But something about that night felt different. The full moon cast a pale light over the avenue, and a thin mist blanketed the ground, setting an eerie scene. I stepped out of the car, feeling the cold night air seep into my skin. I walked along the sidewalk, trying to sense what had drawn me to this place. Then I saw it. On the pavement, near a streetlight, was a dark stain. As I drew closer, I realized it was blood, fresh. Beside the stain, footprints led to a narrow alley between two abandoned buildings. I followed the footprints. The alley was dark, but something told me that this was where I would find answers. As I moved deeper into the alley, I heard it again. The sound of the heavy breathing, the same sound I'd heard over the phone. The sense that I wasn't alone intensified. But then suddenly, the sound stopped. The alley fell silent. I returned to my car, shaken and unsure of what to do. The sense that something was wrong stayed with me. And from that night on, the calls ceased. But the doubt lingers. Who was that woman? Was she really trapped in some kind of unexplainable cycle calling out for help? And who or what was pursuing her? If you love mysteries and the supernatural, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Leave a like to support the work and share with friends who are into the supernatural. Your engagement keeps these secrets alive.